Um, there we go. All right, should be fixed. Okay, we're live. Hello, everyone. This is David Adhan. As usual, have to specify the name properly because today with me I have Dr. David Bradshaw. Um, some of you, some of you who are early listeners to my channel most definitely know that Dr. David Bradshaw is someone I highly respect, someone whose works I regularly cite, particularly the article on conceptual distinction and the idea of epinoia in Orthodox thought, and many other things as well. And I'd like to talk to him and to kind of present to you some of the things that are important in Orthodox theology, such as essence-energy distinction, but also the idea of divine simplicity and how we as Orthodox Christians understand divine simplicity. So I'd like, for those who don't know who Dr. David Bradshaw is, I suppose the doctor himself can introduce himself. So hello, Dr. David Bradshaw.
Yes. Well, hello, and great to be here. I appreciate the invitation. So I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, Kentucky, and I'm Orthodox. I converted to Orthodoxy about 40 years ago. And as you know, and I'm sure most of your readers know, I've written a lot about more Orthodox theology, but sort of looking at it from a more philosophical point of view, and particularly how the church fathers are developing ideas that are already there, or at least concepts that are already there in ancient Greek philosophy, and how they're using ancient Greek philosophy and in many cases sort of developing it differently than happened in the West. And so my book, among other things, also deals with the differences between Eastern Christian thought and Western Christian thought. Divine simplicity is a big issue in all of that, and I look forward to talking with you.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of like a recent stream I did on basically your book on Aristotle, East and West, and one of the things that kind of fascinated me, what you were talking about, is this idea that is actually quite unique, at least from my reading, particularly in Saint Paul in the New Testament, of this idea as energy, as this kind of power that is a supernatural, is a possessive power that supernatural agents possess, right? So to angels, right, and on God himself, and kind of this idea of, participating in the divine energies, or, those who commit evil and move away from the will of God end up participating in the energies of the demons. And it was very fascinating to me because if you listen to, some people online, you'd think this is some Neo-Palamite idea, but it's actually in first, second century Christian fathers as well. So I think there's a lot of ground to be covered as well. And I'm very excited to see more about this because it seems like in terms of orthodoxy, the literature is expanding a lot. But one of the things that kind of I want to pick your brain about, and I read a book called The Transformation of Divine Simplicity, and maybe we can even talk about that a little bit, by Rada Galovitz. It's a very interesting book because the main thesis, what is, at least the way I understand it, is that divine simplicity in the Eastern Fathers is very different, right? In the West, what is generally considered to be identity thesis, which is, in short, the idea that the attributes of God are not only really identical with each other, but also identical with God himself, or the essence of God. Whereas in the East, there was kind of like a balanced approach where the attributes do point out the divine essence and such, but they're not fully and wholly identical in the same sense, not only with each other, but also with the essence of God. And this kind of made me wonder, with the idea of simplicity and such, is I kind of want to ask you as like a basic question to have you explain what even is divine simplicity, and what will we say, like historically and in terms of the Western and Eastern thought, and how will we argue that God is divinely simple in light of admitting that God has attributes that are distinct from each other and from himself? That's kind of like a basic general idea, and how these attributes are participable, right, by created beings, and some other questions that I will also ask after you have explained that. So I suppose that's my question. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's a big one to start with. So, that'll get us kicked off and we can continue then. So what does it mean to say God is simple, and why should we say that? So the idea that God is simple is one of those that does go back to ancient Greek philosophy. You can find it in Aristotle in the Metaphysics, particularly Book 12, Chapter 7. I think at the end of that chapter, there's a passage about this. And for Aristotle, that is sort of a corollary of God's not being material or any kind of, hylomorphic composite entity made up of matter and form. And so really the kind of simplicity that God the prime mover has, is that of any immaterial being. And the same reasoning would apply to the other planetary movers that are in the next chapter in Metaphysics 12. And so you could say broadly that the divine beings in general are simple because they're not material. And that was then a common view among, not all Greek philosophers, because, for instance, the Stoics thought God is material and therefore not simple. But Platonists and Aristotelians and later Neoplatonists all would have agreed about this. And the early church fathers also agreed with that and kind of adopted that language and terminology. Applωτής, the Greek term simplicity, that's the one we're talking about here. And they gave further arguments, not just that God is not a material being, but that if he had parts of any kind, those parts would need some cause to maintain them in unity. And potentially without that cause, he could potentially be subject to decay. And obviously all that's not true. And so he doesn't have parts of any kind that would require some sort of bringing together or composition. And you find that, for instance, in Origin, I think near the beginning of On First Principles, he discusses all that. And then another point that's made by Gregory of Nyssa in particular, it might be made by others earlier, is that whatever property God has, he does not have by participation in anything external to himself. And of course, that would be the common Platonic view of how anything has a property, or anything other than the form of X, that is X, has it by participating in that form. And so in a way, Gregory is locating God at the level of the forms, in the sense that he has whatever properties he has intrinsically to himself as aspects of his being or nature, and not through participation. So that God is life itself, God is wisdom itself, God is being itself, and so on. And there are biblical verses that he cites and that were often cited in the fathers, such as I am he who is, Exodus 3:14, Oon in Greek, in the Septuagint. And so that's sort of a classic proof text for the idea that God is being itself. And then John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And so that's a proof text for the idea God is life itself. So that seemed to sort of dovetail nicely, this philosophical argument that God cannot be dependent on anything else, including dependent through participation, and the scriptural teaching about God's transcendence. And all this, by the way, is common ground to the East and West. I think everything I just said, people on both sides would agree on. The difference comes about in that further step you mentioned that was taken in the West, particularly by Augustine, of saying that the divine essence, or essentia in Latin, just is its own properties or attributes like wisdom, power, goodness. And I discussed this in chapter 9 of my book. I have a section there about Augustine and how did he come to his approach to divine simplicity, which overlaps a little bit, or does overlap with that of Gregory, but also goes beyond it. Okay, they both agree with that God doesn't have any of his attributes by participation. What is different, though, is that for Augustine, that implies or requires, the thing I just said, that the divine essentia is the same as all these different divine attributes. And that's because he doesn't have that distinction that's so common in the Greek fathers between the divine essence, okay, and here we're talking about the Greek word ousia, and the divine powers or energies. So that for Gregory, when he says God is life and wisdom and power and goodness, for him, those are names of divine energies. And he's very explicit about that all the names we give to God, these all terms would all be referred to as divine names, are names of divine energies, whereas the divine ousia has no name. And saying that it has no name, that's sort of, in a way, kind of code language for its having no form and no intelligible structure that could be apprehended by any created mind. And it's an idea that goes back to Plato's Parmenides, the first hypothesis of the Parmenides, where Plato's discussing the one that does not partake of being, and what he describes, the way he describes the one there, is kind of a locus classicus for what later came to be referred to as apophatic theology, where you deny different predicates and attributes of God in order to clarify God's radical transcendence. And so, among the things that Plato says there, that God has no form and no name, as well as no parts. We could add that as well. So that's another philosophical source of the whole idea of divine simplicity. But actually in Plato, in the first hypothesis of the Parmenides, it's a more radical form of simplicity than it had been for Aristotle. For Aristotle, the prime mover and the planetary movers are simple because they're not form matter composites. But for Plato, the one that he's discussing in that first hypothesis of the Parmenides is simple in a more radical way, that there's no conceptual distinction of any kind that can be applied to it. And if you know the Parmenides, it's very cryptic, how you interpret the Parmenides. That remains controversial today, but it has further hypotheses. In fact, the second one goes on to discuss the one that does partake of being, and then you get a totally opposite description. So this is sort of a moment within an unfolding dialectic for Plato. And he doesn't present it as a description of God. That's an interpretation that was given to it later, particularly first by Neo-Pythagoreans around the 1st century BC, and then by Platonists and Neoplatonists. All right, so I may have been digressing a bit there, but I hope all that makes it clear why simplicity is something that Christians should affirm about God, but it makes a big difference what you mean by that. And if you affirm simplicity without having sort of within your conceptual repertoire the distinction of the essence and energies or powers that is so fundamental for Greek thought, but really just isn't there for someone like Augustine. And we could get into that. Why did Augustine not use or even seem to be aware of this kind of distinction? Mostly that's a linguistic difference. He wasn't able to read Greek, and his theological thought wasn't formed by reading prior Christian writings, by and large, because they were written in Greek and they hadn't been translated. All right, so if you don't have that distinction in place, then when you affirm divine simplicity, you're going to be driven to what Augustine does, which is to say the divine essence is the same as all these attributes. And that's problematic, because the attributes include things like knowledge, okay? God's knowledge of creatures. And you immediately run into this modal problem, and I'm sure you're aware of this, that because it's been widely discussed in philosophy, religion, and so on, that God's knowledge appears in many respects to be contingent, because he knows things that we do contingently, right? He knows the fact that you and I are speaking together right now, and that's a contingent state of affairs, that it could have been otherwise, because we're both free beings and we could have chosen differently. And yet this is something that God knows, and Augustine is identifying God's active knowledge, this comprehensive act of knowing, with the divine essence. So you have a kind of a modal mismatch that God's knowledge is in many respects contingent, whereas the divine essence is necessary. And it's not only knowledge, it's also activity or operation. That's another thing that now not Augustine, he doesn't use that term, but later authors like Boethius actually is the first I know of who does identify the divine essentia with the divine operatio or operation. Same issue there. God's activity could be different. And finally, also God's will. And that is something that Augustine does explicitly identify with the divine essentia. It's actually in the Confessions. And a lot of people don't notice this because it comes up fairly late in the Confessions in Book 11 and Book 12. But when he does raise this subject, what Augustine does is to infer from this something very important. He says that the divine will, voluntas, is the divine essentia, and therefore it must be fixed and unchanging for all eternity. And therefore, the things that we perceive as distinct acts of will on the part of God are not. They're just the effects of one single act of will that God performs eternally and in a causal sense, at least prior to the creation of the world. The existence of the world and all the variety there is in the world are all the effects of this one eternal divine act of will. And that's problematic because it means there's no real interaction between God and creatures. Okay, God has already willed from all eternity everything that he does, and that includes everything that he creates, everything he brings into being and sustains in being, and every act of divine revelation, every miracle, every answer to prayer. It's all been sort of coded in from before the creation of the world. And this is a corollary, and Augustine is right. This follows necessarily from the identification he's made between the divine essentia, essence, and the divine will. So I think he's right to see this implication. And he points this out again at the end of Book 12 in the City of God, Book 12, Chapter 17. He pretty much says the same thing. If that's all true, then God never wills anything in response to something that I've done and I've willed. What appears to be a response from a temporal point of view is actually just the unfolding of this eternal divine plan. So you get theological determinism as an upshoot of all this. And so I agree with scholars like Catherine Rogers has a good article about this, why Augustine is and has to be a theological determinist, given his view of divine simplicity. So that's why I say if you affirm divine simplicity without having on board the distinction of essence and energy, then you immediately run into really grave systematic problems in philosophical theology. And these carry throughout the Middle Ages. If you read Aquinas when he talks about predestination in the Summa Theologia, he's right there with Augustine. He says that nothing God wills can be a response to creatures, and therefore God's will for salvation, that some are saved and others are not, is entirely determined, if you will, from the side of God. And it's his own determination and decree, referred to as election, of course, as they interpret that term. And so predestination as well is just a corollary of this kind of theological determinism.
I want to kind of comment, sorry for cutting you off, and this is excellent, by the way. The one thing I want to kind of introduce to some of the audience as well is kind of like, this is kind of like the Western view of essence being equated with will. I think the way I understand it is, if God's essence is necessary, which every theist probably affirms this, right? If God is a necessary existence and the will is identical with God in every single sense, right? then what is willed is also necessary, right? And so the idea of this seems to really go against any form of contingency, not in terms of any part of reality, right? The idea of like possible worlds then ends up becoming there are no such things. Obviously, we as Christians do affirm that God exists in every single possible world. We affirm that God exists as a Trinity in every single possible world. But another thing that I also want to point out is that in Saint Athanasius, he makes the distinction between will and essence. The work of essence generates a divine person. The work of will creates things. And Saint Cyril of Alexandria has a very good quote on this in the Treasuries. This is particularly in Patrologia Graeca, volume 75, page 312. 312. He says, the work of energy of God is to create, while that of nature is to give birth. Therefore, nature and energy in God are not identical. So I think that kind of gives you a kind of like a contrast in the East, where I think the worry of Saint Augustine, and this is a good worry, is that how can we understand God has to be the attributes in a sense, otherwise he's acted upon, and this kind of goes against the idea of God being God. Another thing I want to kind of ask, and you can kind of continue what you were saying. I hope I didn't cut you off a bit too much, because you were on a roll, and that's a great thing. But in Saint Maximus's disputation with Pyrrhus, there's an argument about what is natural being compelled, right? And Saint Maximus tells Pyrrhus that what is natural is not compelled. And it seems to me that St. Maximus is really pointing to Pyrrhus that the will of God, and what he wills and the attributes, they are natural to God. But that doesn't mean that they have, like, he has to do certain things. He's not compelled to act in certain ways. He genuinely, freely does certain things by his own divine will. Would you say that's kind of like a correct understanding of St. Maximus's kind of like understanding of the relationship between nature and will in the debate within monothelitism, for example, historically, just kind of as a
no, without looking back at the passage, but that sounds exactly right. It's just not true that everything that's natural is compelled, particularly among natural beings that have will. And so the fathers were not determinists of any kind. They were not theological determinists, and their opposition to determinism goes back to the very beginning of the Christian encounter with pagan thought, because determinism was all over the place in the ancient world. You had the Stoics, who were both physical determinists and theological determinists, because they thought of God as this sort of omnipresent sort of matter, pneuma, that permeates everything, that directs and governs all things, and our role in life is just to submit to the divine will as it is manifested in the unfolding of events. And then you also had more popular forms of determinism from astrology in particular. That was a big thing in the ancient world, and many people thought that the stars control our destinies. And the fathers, people like Justin Martyr, react against that, and they say, no, we have free will. I think the term that Justin uses is prohieresis eleeuthera, at least forgive my kind of quasi-Erasmian pronunciation there, but eleutheria is freedom, and prohieresis is will or choice. So yeah, it's specifically the capacity to do otherwise at that given moment. And they also, when this issue comes up in relation to God, as it does in the Arian controversy, then St. Athanasius, I think you were mentioning this, he has no hesitation at all to say that the begetting of the Son by the Father is an act of nature. Yes, that's, he's sharing with his own essence, and it's not something that he chooses to do. That doesn't mean that he's compelled to do it either, but it's the free and spontaneous expression of the divine nature. And because it's not something he chooses, you wouldn't say that he could have done otherwise. The Father could never have chosen not to beget the Son. whereas creation is something he chooses. And as you mentioned, St. Cyril then sort of takes that distinction and slightly rephrases it as an act not just of will, but of energy. But it's the same concept. So anyway, yeah, that's why will, when Pyrrhus says that in the dialogue with Maximus, Maximus just says, no, will is natural, but it's not compelled. Because God has will, and nothing compels the divine will.
Yeah, and with relation to the eternal generation, and this is kind of an explanation that I had a couple of months ago, which I will say it's a decent explanation at the very least, to kind of like the logic of Saint Athanasius. For example, when we talk about the existence of God, right? Some people use the omnipotence paradox, and a kind of like a funny question you can ask. Well, do you think that God can will himself not to exist, right? And that's because, in a sense, right, we as Orthodox affirm, God is his existence in a sense, right? It's an energy of his. But and that's why, for example, it's not something that he can just destroy, right? He can't go against himself. It's the same thing with divine fatherhood. God being a father, right? God as father is essential not to his divine nature, but to his person, right? To his hypostasis. And so this is also why the Son, the identity of the Son is kind of acts in the same manner. It's his very identity as being the Son. You talked about the generation from the nature, and some people kind of understand this wrongly, and they kind of have a Thomistic understanding of this, where they see like begetting as a essential power. As if like it's one of the powers of like the other powers, like creating the world, and that seems to me something that you can't really accept, because does the Son have that power? Does the Holy Spirit have that power? We wouldn't say that the Son is of the nature of the Holy Spirit. They have the same nature. I mean, technically, in a sense, it seems like it, but the essence of the Father points out that the Son has his essence from the Father. That's what it points out. It doesn't point out that there's a divine essence that produces three persons. And that seems to be kind of like the view that you see in Western thought, especially, where they're not willing to take that to its logical conclusion. But if the essence is the first principle of everything and not the Father, then even the Father being cause or uncause will be called into question. The only way you can get around that is saying the Father is identical with the divine essence in every single regard. Okay, but then is he distinct from the Son and the Holy Spirit? If he is, then the Son and the Holy Spirit are not divine. Right, so there's kind of like these problems as well in taking this view, at the very least, if I understand it, and why it's important to point out that divine simplicity does not necessitate everything being identical with God. So I kind of, if you don't have more points to add, I think we can kind of go to some of the questions that I had prepared. Is that fine with you?
Oh yeah, that's fine.
So. Let me allow me to just make sure. Someone actually made like a different form of this argument in the chat as well. That might be interesting. Let me just get to the questions. Okay, I guess a good question to ask will just simply be: you're talking about distinctions, right, in God. How is it that these distinctions don't entail division, basically? Aren't they the same thing? Doesn't it logically follow that to speak of X and Y is to say that these are divisible, separated things? How does it not follow? I guess if it's too vague, I can reframe it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a fair question. And I think we're kind of fortunate we have these two distinct, quite different words in English, distinction and division. And it's not always as clear in Greek, so people do wrestle with this sometimes. But they're different. Okay, two things can be distinct without being divided or divisible from one another. And in this case, when we're talking about divine energies, that really should be pretty clear, because the energies are activities. All right. The word energia in Aristotle, it's sort of its root meaning is activity. particularly activity as the realization of a dunamis, a capacity of some kind. And so you can have multiple activities that you're performing at a given moment in relation to a single object, even that are nonetheless distinct. They're distinct but not divisible. Okay, so I both know and love. We just had a grandson, okay, who was born to us, our daughter, a few days ago. So I'll use him. Both know and love this little infant child. And those are distinct acts. It's possible for one to exist without the other, at least be possible to know him without loving him. But even though they're distinct, they're not divisible in the sense of being separate things, or so unless you want to define the term in that particular way, then I think it's better to say that they're distinct but simply not divisible. I hope that got at what the person was asking about. But a lot depends on what you mean by divisible. And sometimes people, I think most often people mean physically divisible or divisible as separate parts. And that's not the case for the energies.
Okay, so kind of like, the OBS was telling me there was some kind of disconnection, so maybe the stream might have missed. But I think I can kind of reframe it, and if you think that I'm wrong or right, you can kind of comment on that as well. The way I understand it is that our operations or our activities are not something that is, even human beings or operations and activities are not something, though they're distinct, not something that is separate from us. And a point that I saw, I think I read this from Saint Gregory the Theologian in his 5 Theological Orations. I'm pretty sure, yeah. And he makes a very interesting point about simplicity. He doesn't say God is divinely simple because all of the attributes are identical in every single way. He says, he gives the example of the soul. And he says, well, look, the soul is incorporeal, right? It's not something that is physical. And it has distinctions. It has aspects. The soul has different aspects. But the soul is simple, right? So that kind of begs, that kind of makes one ask themselves, I mean, even if the soul is simple while having plural aspects to it, then there really isn't a good argument on why God cannot have plural aspects or energies or whatever you want to say, attributes, while also being simple. I mean, I think that argument can be made from the soul. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. And that was a common analogy. The soul as an immaterial entity is simple, and yet it does many different things and has many different faculties, including knowing and willing, and also, the other faculties that the soul would have in its bodily state, such as the faculty of growth and nutrition and movement and sensation, etc. And yet it's a simple thing. So it's a very intuitive idea and totally commonplace to say that a single simple thing can have many faculties and many activities. That's now, you do have to qualify by saying the God is simple in a more fundamental way, more thoroughgoing way than the soul is. Because the soul, even though, and this is a point that a Thomist, I think would rightly make, that the soul is still a created thing, and therefore there's what in Thomism they would call the composition of essence and esse, act of being, that God calls it into being, and therefore it's dependent on a higher cause, and you could call that a kind of composition. At least they do in Thomism, and that's fine. And so God clearly doesn't have that kind of composition. He's not created and not dependent in that way. So he's simpler in a more radical way, but nothing in that would exclude that he has multiple capacities and forms of activity.
Yeah, and I was kind of reminded with the I took this from your article on energies in the New Testament, where when Saint Paul says, I think 1 Corinthians 12:6, he says explicitly that there are diversities of energies, but there's one God that acts all in all. And Saint John Damascus pretty much says the same thing, and he paraphrases in his exposition of the Orthodox faith, just says, divinity is everywhere simple, but also, in an indivisibly divided manner, has his energies. Another point that this is from Rade Galowitz's book Transformation of Divine Simplicity, a point that Saint Gregory of Nyssa makes. Saint Gregory of Nyssa makes a very interesting argument that actually does have precedence, surprisingly, in Islamic theology. He argues that simplicity is not that it's just oneness, right? He doesn't think of unity as oneness. He thinks unity is like an action of making one, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in Arabic, that's also what tawhid means, right? Tawhid means making one. Now, amongst, for example, Neoplatonists, they think making one means making one in our mind, for example, right? I don't think that's a really good explanation. The general understanding is making one. And that kind of begs the question, making one from what? Making one from one? But that doesn't really make any sense. Making one from, basically being the balance of one and many, or unity and plurality, as the source of reality himself. He is the balance between the two. And so in reality, we also see the balance of these two concepts. And that's what unity or simplicity fundamentally kind of refers to. At least that's what Galowitz kind of explained St. Gregory of Nyssa's argument about this. And he gave the example of the virtues, right? The virtues are natural to God. And we have the virtues through grace, grace is natural to us. So in a sense, there's kind of that connectivity, the way I understand it at least. And all of the virtues are connected with each other, right? There's a connection between, for example, I guess it's not a perfect example, but justice and goodness, right? There's no proper justice without goodness. Though they are two different things, there is that interconnectivity between the virtues. And so there's a relation between the various different virtues as an example of the uniting principle of these things. And I thought when that's brought into light, it makes it much clearer why even the Trinity itself, right, kind of has this balance, this unique balance of unity and plurality that other religions don't really have. And it really confuses me why a Christian would want to take a metaphysical approach, that kind of equivocates everything to one thing. And like, it seems to me that you're kind of not using the potential of the faith that you have. If you have any comments on anything you want to add, sorry for kind of just ranting about it, but
yeah, well, I think the analogy with the virtues is helpful, and there are complications, of course, as you think through some of the details. It seems like there are some virtues that could exist without other virtues. So you could presumably be courageous without being friendly. Now, Aristotle, when he talks about it, he says there's sort of this overarching virtue of practical wisdom, phronesis, and in order to have that kind of wisdom, you have to have all those particular moral virtues, including courage and friendliness and generosity and self-control and all the others. But I think on his view, still, if you don't have maybe that overarching virtue, you might have one particular moral virtue and not some of the others. So, but like you said, there are other virtues that do require other particular complements, so to speak, such as justice and goodness. And I think maybe courage would require some willingness for self-sacrifice. In other words, a kind of generosity, maybe not generosity altogether, but a certain form of generosity in which you're willing to give your life for someone else or something greater than yourself. So anyway, that, as an analogy, that's kind of helpful because some divine energies could exist without other particular ones, but in other cases, that's not the case. It all depends on which ones you're talking about. even if God had not created the world, okay, which, as we were saying, that's a choice God makes. Even if he had not created the world, there would still be God's goodness and love and knowledge and power. They wouldn't necessarily have the same objects. They wouldn't have any creatures as their objects, but there would still be the love among the persons of the Trinity and the knowledge and the goodness that's manifested in those intra-Trinitarian relationships. So those are energies that are, to that extent, they're eternal and necessary. And when I say they're necessary, I mean they exist in some form from all eternity, no matter what God does, what he chooses to do. But on the other hand, they're not necessary in this other sense, that the particular form they take, like God's goodness, for example, takes the particular form given the choices he's made of, doing certain good things that he does in relation to creatures in this particular world that he's made, that could have been otherwise, and the same for God's knowledge and will. So even though they exist necessarily in some form, they don't exist necessarily in the particular form that they take in this particular world. So, and there are other divine energies, like foreknowledge, for instance, I think is one that St. Basil mentions, that could have not existed at all and will someday come to an end. Because for Basil, when the world comes to an end, which it will, then the foreknowledge God has of what takes place in the world will also come to an end. And not to mention the gifts of the Spirit that you brought up from 1 Corinthians 12. Those are considered by the fathers to be divine energies, and clearly they did not have to exist. And so plenty of energies are sort of in that category of being fully contingent and dependent on God's decision to create and the particular things that he has created. So it gets complicated. And I think sometimes the objections, and the confusion that arises are just because people want to sort of fit everything into one box. And the fact that they're all energies doesn't mean you can fit them all into the same box. There's actually a lot of diversity and a lot of distinctions you do have to draw.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, because some people kind of think of them as that, and they have to kind of be categorized in the same way. The way I understand as well with things like, for example, the incarnation, right? That's not if there wasn't even a world or anything like, there wasn't any created being, then the incarnation doesn't really seem to be something that will have been actualized. But I think especially with the kind of idea of power, right? Dunamis in Greek, even though the actualization, might have not even been possible for things like, in the sense of, for example, if God chose not to create, right, then he won't have foreknowledge, because there won't be anything to have foreknowledge of other than himself and his two hands, so to speak, right? The Son and the Holy Spirit. But he still has the power to actualize. Whether it is actualized is dependent on his free choice, right? It's not dependent on the structure of his divine essence from philosophical speculation, but by his own free choice, he ends up doing whatever he wants to do, kind of in proper accordance with his nature, at the very least, the way I understand it. I also want to. Oh yeah, I think it will be decent to read this section, because it very much touches on what you're saying. Because St. Gregory of Nyssa, for example, talks about, well, yes, indeed, some virtues don't seem to necessitate each other, but when we talk about perfect virtues, which is something proper to speak about God, then in a sense, all of the virtues are presupposed in unison. And Gallowitz comments with Gregory, this is Gregory of Nyssa, we are far from holding that divine, this is page 212, we are far from holding that divine simplicity entails that God only has a single property or that God has no properties. So far, in fact, that in his hands, the doctrine of simplicity actually comes to entail that God has multiple properties. And why is it the case? Because it's the perfect virtues that are reciprocally entailing each other, right? So there's this balance in St. Gregory of Nyssa here. I want to ask a question. One of the questions, well, someone in the live chat asked this in a different form. He was kind of argumentative about it. The question was basically kind of like trying to make an argument. P1, essence is God, energy. P2, energy is God. P3, essence and energy are not identical. Conclusion, there are two gods, which is just a really bad argument. But let me reframe it to make him sound smarter. Particularly in St. Gregory Palamas, it seems to be that there are two divinities, a higher divinity that is posited, which is proper to essence, and a lower divinity that is posited to the energies. Is this really the case? Is there really two divinities in Orthodoxy, or is this just a very poor understanding of what the Orthodox doctrine on this topic is?
Well, definitely the latter. It's not the case there are two divinities. And yeah, I actually have a paper about that, so this is something that Akindinos kept harping on. Akindinos was Gregory's opponent, particularly during the first phase of the dispute. No, not the first, the second phase. You had Barlaam and then Akindinos and then Gregorus Nicephorus. Anyway, Akindinos he couldn't get over this, that in an epistle, Gregory had at one point used this term higher divinity for the essence, the divine ousia, and then lower divinity or subordinate divinity for the energies. And Gregory retracted that, or at least revised it in the revised form of that epistle that he sort of, prepared and blessed for public circulation. Because I think he realized this language, this terminology could be misleading and could suggest, two divinities. And that's not what he was trying to say. It is language that he's sort of taking from Dionysius the Areopagite. And I go into all this in the paper. Dionysius uses that term theotes as the name of a divine energy, namely the energy of deification. And in the earlier fathers, like Gregory of Nyssa, it's also the name of an energy, but it's sort of the name, it's used equivalently with theos itself. And for Gregory, if you know Gregory, like in Not Three Gods and other places, he'll say that the term theos comes from theomai, which means to oversee.
Behold,
the sort of comprehensive divine action of overseeing and governing creation. So because it's equivalent to theos, this can get very confusing, because when Dionysius the Areopagite is using it, it's not equivalent to theos. It's rather this more specific divine energy of deification. So you have to look at these different sources that Gregory Palamas is sort of referring to, and he actually had discussed these passages already in some earlier correspondence with Akindinos, and that's why writing to him, as one friend to another, he was assuming that Akindinos sort of knew what he was talking about when he used this phrase about higher and lower divinity. But Akindinos, I think, willfully chose to disregard that whole context of discussion in order to sort of focus on this one phrase taken out of context, which Palamas then revised before he kind of blessed this letter to be circulated publicly. So anyway, it's just a tempest in a teapot over maybe an ill-advised choice of terminology that he didn't, insist upon in any way. But the basic idea that divinity, like theos itself, is the name of an energy, that's a central concept for the whole Greek patristic tradition. And like I said, Gregory of Nyssa is very explicit about this. And it really in some form goes back to, but long before Gregory. You have to look at Philo of Alexandria, because he already, as a biblical thinker, a pious Jew, he was already thinking about what are the names we give to God, and what do we mean by them, given that God is beyond human knowing and beyond human language. And so he had already articulated this idea that the divine ousia has no name and is radically unknowable in sort of the way that Plato had described in the Parmenides, and that the names we give to God, including the term theos itself, is the name. Now, he didn't use the word energy, he used the word power, dunamis, but it's the name of a divine power, the creative power by which God calls the world into being. And then there's the other great divine name, Lord or Kyrios. Those are, both very prominent in the Septuagint, especially. And he said Kyrios is the name of the divine ruling power that governs the cosmos. And so already in Philo, you have this idea that the names we give to God are really names of divine powers and not the divine essence. So it's not surprising that the Cappadocians, among others, sort of adopt that framework, except in slightly different terms, using the word energia instead of dunamis. So anyway, it's what happened historically. It's kind of just a confluence of what do they call it? An unfortunate convergence of events, where Aquinas had a lot of influence on the way that the Latin delegation in Constantinople perceived this whole controversy between Greg Palamas and first of all Barlaam, but Palamas and his opponents in general. And so that fixation on the idea of a higher and lower divinity was something that the Latins kind of picked up on and recoiled in horror and said, "Oh, well, Palamas is saying that, then he's obviously wrong and a heretic." And even today, I mean, very recently, you can find Catholic scholars like Juan Nadal, who's written a lot about Aquinas, and he's sort of a fan of Aquinas and thinks he was right against Palamas. And so this sort of thinking continues, and it's just a total distortion of what Palamas actually said. And like I said, I have an article that goes into that in more detail, but it really never should have received all the attention it has, in my opinion.
Yeah. And the way I understand it is kind of like the principle of essence and energy, right? Essence is God as he knows himself and as he is in himself, that is inaccessible to us. And energy is the reflection, in a sense, of himself to us, right? And sometimes even to himself, right? When we talk about energetic manifestation within the Trinity, like the Holy Spirit manifesting the love of the Father and the Son and such. So when it's understood in that manner, all we are saying with divinity, which interestingly, St. John Damascus in the Exposition of Orthodox Faith names divinity with the name God, right? So because there's one divinity in the Trinity, there's one God in the Trinity. That's the whole point of on not three gods. And what's interesting is that even Western fathers made this argument. I believe St. Ambrose, Dr. Bo Branson in his Logical Problem of the Trinity paper, we talked about this in his stream as well, in the stream I did with him on my channel, where he makes this exact point that, even from Western fathers, this idea that there's one energy of divinity and the name of this divinity is God is enough of an argument for us to point out that, wait, there's one God, right? Because the omniscience, omnipotence, all of these attributes is the same. It's the same in the persons of the Trinity, and they're indivisible too. But to higher, lower divinities, that the lower divinity is just a reflection. An analogy someone I know used is like, think of like the cold of an ice pack being applied to an injured leg, right? The cold of the ice pack is kind of like this higher cold that is proper to itself, but it reflects the coldness it has to the leg. They're not two separate colds in a sense. There's not the cold of the leg that comes from the leg. It's applied to the leg, right? It comes from the ice, and so it's a lower cold, but it's the same cold that the ice pack has in itself. So it's the same kind of logic here. They're not two divinities, right? Rather, the energy of divinity is a reflection of God's life that he has in himself to us in accordance with our capacity. So that's why this idea that, when we say that, I personally don't even like calling the essence God and like the energy God, because I see this in like more like the pop level people. I don't like this signification. I mean, God is a divine name, first of all, and it's a name of the divinity, which is a divine nature. That's the proper way. Because as St. Basil the Great says in letter 234, everything we know from God is not in his essence, but in his energies, and including, divinity itself, right? So do you think that there's a precedence in calling the essence God, energy God, as if like, it seems very strange to me, and I see this in, like, again, like pop level persons, but not in like the fathers or anything like that. I don't see this regularly, unless it's
Yeah.
like as like a, like they, it's like a designative like predicative term, maybe, like sometimes, but like that's the most they do, not in terms of identity.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I don't think they do it even as a predication. I can't think of anyone who says the divine ousia is theos. That would just be kind of a weird way of speaking, because by referring to the divine ousia, you're obviously referring to the ousia of God, right? So that's it would be redundant if nothing else. But it's also confusing because theos, as they understand it, is the name of an energy. So the divine ousia just has no name. And so here's an analogy that I like to use, that I think gets at this idea that the divine ousia is the source that's manifested in the energies. And precisely as their source, it remains beyond knowing and beyond naming. The analogy I like to use is a computer program. I mean, this is an analogy that we're all very familiar with today, so that's one reason I like to use it. A computer program is something that you may interact with at great length and in detail. Like if you're playing a video game or something, you're interacting with that program, right? In all kinds of complex ways. And there are all kinds of complex ways the program is manifested to you. And it actually happens to be interactive. The way the program manifests itself to you depends partly on how you react and interact with it. But at the same time, you never know that program in itself, as it is, so to speak, in its own nature, because in its own nature, it's a long series of coded instructions, written in some computer language that you probably don't even know. And so, and you don't need to know. You may know that you may be an expert at that video game. You may know that program better than anyone else in the world in terms of it as something that is manifest and available for human interaction, without knowing a single word of the code that it's written in. Okay, so that, I think, is the kind of relationship they have in mind when they talk about the ousia as beyond human knowledge, even though it is manifested in the energies. And we interact with and engage with and are able to know and to name the energies, but we never know and can never name the ousia because it's always beyond our knowing. And it's not a difficult concept, okay? It's something we're very familiar with. I mean, right now, you and I are using Zoom, okay? I have no idea whatsoever what Zoom is in its own nature, how it's written, how it functions internally. I don't know, and I don't need to know. It would be totally useless knowledge if I did know it, okay? What I care about is using Zoom. And so that is sort of the relationship we're in with God. We're not here to try to sort of probe the deep mysteries of the divine nature. That's spiritual hubris, to think you possibly could do that. We're here to love God and obey God and to follow his will in our lives. And so all of that is what God makes available to us in what the fathers call the divine energies.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent kind of analogy as well, right? We don't know the code of the thing that we're using. We don't know the exact inner nature of it, but within, in another aspect, we have complete knowledge, not complete, but like good enough knowledge about it where we can even go as far as to use it or interact with it, similar to God. it also goes to show that kind of like a lot of this, although we're dealing with philosophical and theological topics, it also kind of gets to the practical aspect of Orthodox spirituality as well, where it's not about kind of these propositional thing. It's kind of it has propositions, but it also has experience, right? One-to-one experience with a person or three divine persons, really. And I think again, like this objection really completely and utterly, I mean, the fact that it's still being used today, like the higher divinity, lower divinity, is I'm starting to think that it's like a filtering tool, right? Like if someone uses that argument against me, I like filter them out, and I basically say to myself, yeah, you act like you know a lot, but you don't actually know what you're talking. Like it's something that I see happen regularly. It's the same thing with conceptual distinction, right? I see people regularly act as if epinoia is understood in the same way as Thomist understanding of notional distinction or notional knowledge, or like the notion is not real, right? Like unicorn, right? Now unicorn is an epinoia, it's something that we conceive, but the soul, which is a real existing thing, can also be perceived by the mind, right? St. Gregory of Nyssa says the mind is the highest part of man's intellect, and the mind can perceive realities that are invisible. If I may say, true faith. And you know, a soul and a unicorn, these are two things that are being conceived, but one of these conceptual things is a real thing, whereas the unicorn is not a real thing. It's not a real existent thing. It doesn't really exist in the world, but a soul really does exist. And we have perception of it invisibly. It's the same thing with God. For example, Leontius of Jerusalem, in his argument against Monophysites, when the conceptual distinction argument is used against him, where the Monophysites say, we accept the conceptual distinction, he says, so how do you see the soul? Do you see it by the senses? Obviously not. The only knowledge you can have of invisible things is by conceptual, by epinoia. That's why it's a conceptual distinction. It's not opposed to real. I think this is a bit of like a tangent, but the point that I'm trying to make is that Orthodox theology and patristic theology is very complex, and a lot of people, unfortunately, I see kind of like act like they're experts at it, when in reality they make elementary mistakes to anyone who has like a basic reading. I won't call myself an expert, but I have a basic reading of what the fathers say and about these things, and it's very I would recommend a lot of people to do that as well. There's going to be a lot of interesting things that I think a lot of people are going to see, even if they read like basic texts like the 5 theological orations. I'm going to move on to the next question, and before I move on, I also want to those in the live chat, feel free to ask questions as well. Your questions will be, you're fine with answering the live chat questions, right? Of the people watching us right now, are you fine with that?
Sure.
Yeah. So your questions will also be answered. If you want to support the stream, if you want to support me, you can also ask them by super chats. If you want to super support it, I guess you can go to the Patreon link in the description below. So I'm gonna next question. It seems that some fathers, for example, St. John of Damascus, say God has only one energy. So how is it then, if God has one energy, right? Like in the Sixth Ecumenical Council, it was argued that Christ, for example, has two energies and two wills, right? One divine energy and one human energy. And so a lot of people take that to mean, well, that means there aren't a plurality of energies. It means there must only be one. How is this really the case, or is this again a very gross misunderstanding? Obviously, I know the answer. I have talked about this, but I'd like your take on this as well, because it's something.
Yeah,
that
well,
some
it's a
people
good question to raise, because people do get confused, I think, by this. But it's just the semantic flexibility, I think, of the word energy. That's true both in Greek and English. If you ask how many energies do I have just one human energy? That, yeah, you could say that. But it's also very natural to say I have many different energies. You know, we do both. When I talk about, if I'm really focused on some particular thing I'm doing, you could say equally, you know, I'm focusing all my energy on this task, or you could say I'm focusing all my energies, plural, on this task. And they both be true, and they would mean the same thing. Because the concept of energy just has that flexibility that you you can speak of something as having one energy or multiple energies, depending on sort of what point of view you're thinking about. And it is true that in the monothelite controversy and the monoenergist controversy that it sort of grew out of, the issue was, does Christ have a distinct human energy and a distinct divine energy? And so they naturally were sort of using the word energy in the singular. That was what the whole issue was about. And of course, that's why the council then said, yes, he does have a human energy and a divine energy. But that never was meant to exclude that you couldn't also refer to a plurality of divine energies, because that had been part of traditional language for centuries. Like you mentioned earlier, Basil's Epistle 234, where his energies, plural, come down to us, while his essence remains beyond our reach. And the gifts of the Spirit were always seen as a plurality, and they were referred to as energies, plural. There's for instance, Gregory Nazianzen. He interprets the seven spirits in the prophecy of Isaiah, chapter 11, as referring to the gifts of the Spirit. And there's 7 of them. So in that case, you actually have a number, how many there are. And so there's no one ever saw this as problematic in any way, that you could refer both to the single divine energy or the plurality of divine energies, and you'd be referring to the same thing, just like it wouldn't be problematic in English. Does that make sense? So, I mean, there was no controversy about it, which just tells you this is just an artifact of language. It's not truly a theological issue.
Yeah, and there's also a quote from Saint Gregory Palamas on this. I want to kind of get to that. Yeah, it's on the Divine Energies 7. This is cited by Dr. Tijuan Pino's dissertation on Saint Gregory Palamas, Being and Naming God. I think that's the title. He says, when we say there is only one energy in God, we understand the one that encompasses all of them. So it's not one in exclusion of the plural, just like how we believe in one God, not in exclusion of the 3 persons, right? So similarly, right, there's a similar, not the exact same logic, but there's a very similar logic here. And I think a lot of people get confused about that point as well. And I think a good way to kind of understand it as well is that the each is in one and the one is in each, right? That God is in each, and each of these energies is in God. And there's this kind of like a relationship as well, so that we can say they're one without taking out the plurality of it. There's also other statements from the Fathers where they talk about the plurality of the divine energies as well. Another question was, so you and Saint Gregory Palamas and other Orthodox Christians seem to say, theoretically, that some energies have a beginning and an end. You talked about this as well, right? With things like foreknowledge and such. But and the objection is, but energies are supposed to be divine and uncreated, and so they can't have a beginning and an end. How can something divine have a beginning and end? So what would your response be to this kind of objection?
Yeah, well, so the energies are, precisely that in which God interacts with creatures. And creatures do have a beginning and an end. And in fact, all of creation has at least a beginning. So another, you mentioned foreknowledge, clearly for Basil and for Palamas, foreknowledge will have an end. Another example that Palamas refers to is creation itself as an act that God performs. He thinks of that as ending on the 6th day in Genesis. So that doesn't mean that God's activity in relation to creation ends. In fact, he also affirms that God is upholding all things in being, continually without end. But nonetheless, the calling of things into being that's described in Genesis, that's the divine energy that ended. So I don't see anything problematic about that. It's just, again, it's sort of built into this fact that I mentioned, that the word we're referring to as energy, is energia, whose root meaning is activity. Okay. And obviously activities often do have a beginning and an end. The reason we more often prefer to translate it as energy is because in the case of God, his activity can enter into and vivify and empower and enlighten creatures. Okay. And something that does that to you is a kind of an energy that you receive and by which you're transformed. And so that's why the word energy, I think, is appropriate. In Greek, they're the same word. Okay. We have these two words in English, activity and energy. In Greek, they're the same word, energia. And so you have to be aware of sort of the connotations when that term is in use, that even though we may translate it one way, the other meaning is also sort of implicitly present in most cases. So again, that's why I think for them it's just unproblematic that the divine energiae often have a beginning and an end. Okay, the gifts of the Spirit, that's another example. Those are paradigmatic cases of divine energies, and they have a beginning at Pentecost. And then each particular one, as it's given to a particular person at a given time and place, will have an end. If nothing else, at the death of that person, if not earlier. So that too is totally unproblematic. They're energies, but they have a beginning and an end.
Yeah, I think there's a quote from Saint Maximus the Confessor that I think is also a good response to this. He says this is in Capita 1, it's also in Patrologia Graeca, volume 90. He says, God never ceases from good things because he never began them. And this is in contrast to Genesis 2:2, which says, and on the seventh day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. So he's kind of contrasting, well, when God rested from his works, he didn't rest from the eternal works. He rested from some of the works that you're talking about as well, right? That kind of are related to creation. I think another, maybe you can also clarify this as well, is the way I understand, for example, with creation, right? The activity of God creating the world is different from his power to create. Sometimes the power is also named as energy, though usually they're understood distinctively, right? So the power, God eternally has the power to create. That doesn't have a beginning and an end. What has a beginning and an end is the energy of creation. And the idea I'm trying to get to is both the Cappadocian and the Damascene idea of energy as being understood as, what was it? Agent, energy effect. There's this kind of I might be wrong, but am I right on the money? So in a sense, we can kind of say, well, they don't have a beginning and an end. In a different sense, the energies, they do have a beginning and an end. And it's this different category that has a beginning and an end of the activity of God himself that is fundamentally temporal, for example. Would you agree with that, with the way I explain it, or anything?
Yeah, that's all true. And so I think what you're pointing out is, again, you have to look at these words in context. And often the word dunamis and energia, even though they begin as correlative opposites, okay? In Aristotle, he coins the word energia to mean the realization of a dunamis. And so it can mean energia then can be the activity, whereas the dunamis is the faculty, or it can be the actuality, whereas the dunamis is the potentiality. And I talk about this in chapter 1 of my book. They have a broad range of meanings, even in Aristotle, but they're correlative terms, and they're always contrastive terms, even though they're linked to one another. Well, what happens, though, in the Hellenistic era is that I think, as far as I know, at least beginning with the Stoics think of the names of the different gods as names of different divine powers. Okay, like Zeus, they derive from Zine, to live, And so that's the name of God as living and active throughout all things, or something like that. So the word power, dunamis, comes to mean active manifestation, which is not what it meant in Aristotle or in classical Greek, but in the Hellenistic era it does. And that's why also I mentioned Philo of Alexandria, another good example of this. Dunamis for him is the name of God's ruling power and creative power. And these are actively manifest and present in all things. They're not just capacities that God has. So the word dunamis is sort of expanding in meaning. But meanwhile, you also have the word energia is still there in its original Aristotelian sense as the active manifestation of a capacity. All right. And so dunamis then, instead of being correlative and opposed to energia, in many contexts, they're overlapping in meaning. They both mean active manifestation. And you just have to be aware of how a particular author is using these terms in a particular context. The one author may use, in one context, use them as sort of correlative opposites. In another context, may use them as almost synonymous. And that's just the way language works. And that was certainly still remained the case in the fathers. And Palamas is aware of this. And so there's a passage where he talks about this in the Triads that I think I quote in my book, where he says, so the word dunamis, sometimes is opposed to energia, and sometimes they mean the same thing. And you just have to be aware of that. But it's not problematic if you're aware of it. And so, an interesting thing to point out, I think maybe you were kind of getting at this, is that so the creative power of God exists necessarily, independently of whether God ever creates or not, whereas the creative energia does not. Okay, it's something that God chooses to manifest in that particular way. And in that, if you're talking about the energia, then you're going to have to use it as, in a sense where it's opposed to the dunamis, or as the active manifestation of the dunamis. But you could also talk about the divine power as manifest in creation itself, okay? And it would still be that same dunamis. So that's how these words work.
Yeah, I think that's actually a fantastic explanation, because some people do get confused about this, where they have a difficulty understanding kind of like the characteristics of the energies in contrast to the fact that God eternally has this power. How does it make sense? And I think that's a really good explanation. It also bears in mind, scriptures say that everything God created was through His word, right? Through His Son, and Saint Paul calls the Son the power of God, right? The Christ is the living power of God, and so there's this kind of interesting dynamic I've noticed. I think in De Gritis, for example, Saint Athanasius says that the Father is the essence, and a lot of people took that to mean that that's identity thesis, etc., etc. But when reading the Fathers holistically, I understood, wait a second, the Son is the power of God, and the Father is, in a predicative sense, or in some sense, essence. And the Holy Spirit, St. Gregory of Nyssa says in the Great Catechism, is the revealer of the energy of the Son. There's kind of like a relationship here of like the modes in which the persons act both eternally. It's like the Father is kind of like, as like the essence is, when we talk about, is hidden, right? And He is known through the Son. And the Son purifies and illuminates us to this knowledge by the Holy Spirit. And this script in the New Testament particularly, this is laid out, right? In not only in the Gospels, but also the epistles of Saint Paul. And it seems to me that there's a really Trinitarian understanding of these terms as well. It's not as if the way they work and they function a uniquely Trinitarian way, is what I've noticed. It's not as if we're doing this monotheism, like strict monotheism of just Unitarian monotheism, and just tacking onto stuff. No, this is actually how our theology works alongside with the persons of the Trinity, and how they work out, right? All things are done from the Father, through the Son, and in the Holy Spirit, right? Which St. Paul says this, right? From whom, through whom, and in whom are all things. KJV translates too, but I think the Greek use east, which can be translated as in. So I think that's a more accurate way of understanding it. And so, all of the, it's another thing about the divine energies is that all of the energies are in the Holy Spirit, which is why when Christ sends the Holy Spirit with the Father, that's not the filioque, that's the Holy Spirit, that's the energies that are in the Holy Spirit being sent to creation, whether it's to the apostles or whether it's to, us in the church. And that's how these things operate, right? The life of God being revealed in the Spirit. And also it explains how, like, St. Gregory the Theologian in the start of the Theological Orations kind of points out, the Father was first revealed, and like explicitly, right? The Son and the Holy Spirit were revealed as well in the Old Testament, but the Father is explicitly revealed in the Old Testament. The Son is explicitly revealed in the New Testament, and the Holy Spirit is explicitly revealed in kind of like the continuation in the Book of Acts in the life of the church. And so this kind of this structure showcases the strength and the power of the revelation as well, because when the Father is revealed, it's kind of like it's more unclear in a sense. When the Son is revealed, things become clear, but in the Holy Spirit, now we are truly communing in the life of that God has in himself in the Spirit. And I think this being really missed in theological explication outside, a lot of people in the West, I think what they do good is they, in a biblical sense, make this point, but I think in the theological point, the patristic tradition in the Orthodox Church is incredibly clear on this, at least the way I see it, and how these seemingly problematic statements from the fathers can be understood in a correct manner, not taking them out of context, but applying them holistically in how we understand the scriptures. And we'll just say this is kind of like, do you have any comments about some of what I said? And if there's anything wrong I said, you can feel free to correct me on this as well.
Well, no, nothing wrong, but maybe just I'll pick up on a couple of points. Like you mentioned, St. Paul saying that the Christ is the power of God. I think that's 1 Corinthians 1:24, the power of God and the wisdom of God. And that can be confusing because, we've been referring, you and I have been talking all along about God having many powers to do many different things, right? And that he has these powers intrinsically, innately, and we're generally ascribing these to God, the Trinity. And now it looks like St. Paul is saying, no, it's just the Son who is the power of God. And that I think would be a slightly different use of the term. But I think what he has in mind is that sense of power that I was referring to that was common in the Hellenistic era of power as the active manifestation. And that's certainly true, that Christ is the active manifestation of the Father. He says, if you've seen me, you have seen the Father. So that makes perfect sense. We just shouldn't confuse that use of the term with the other use of the term where we're referring to divine powers in general, in sort of more philosophical way as the capacity to do something. And I also wanted to just pick up on something you mentioned, that St. Athanasius says that the divine essence, Ousia, is the Father, in a certain context. And I think that's something worth trying to clarify a little bit, because this comes up in any discussion, I think, of early Trinitarian teaching, the whole Arian controversy. And it's a little confusing. And what happened was, as I recall, the Council of Nicaea in 325, in the original version of the Creed, they say the Son is begotten of the essence of the Father. And Athanasius had to explain that and comment on it. And so he said, well, it's not referring to anything other than the Father himself. So that in the Creed there, it's when it says the essence of the Father, it simply means the Father. And of course, then that was adopted, you might say officially, because the next and final version of the Creed at the Council of Constantinople, 381, they dropped that phrase, essence of, and they just said begotten of the Father before all ages, light of light, true God. And so Athanasius, I think, was right about that. But the reason it's confusing is because it looks like he's then identifying the essence with the Father, whereas we would tend to say the essence is what the three persons have in common. And whereas the Father is one of the three persons. Well, for what it's worth, I mean, I'll just throw this out there. This is another place where I find that little analogy with a computer program kind of helpful. Now, computer programs didn't exist in the ancient world, so this is not an analogy anyone ever used in the ancient world. But to me, it's just a helpful way of thinking that if you imagine a program that's resonant on just one computer, and that computer itself isn't a material entity anyway, it's just a sort of self-subsistent reality in which there's nothing that it is except sort of the, I don't know how to put it, the instantiation, the embodiment of that program. Well, then when that one computer exists alone, so to speak, then you would just say that computer is the program, or there's no difference there between the program and the computer. But then if that computer, then you might say, begets a son, okay, you can see where this analogy is going, then you would have two different computers, both with the same program, both running the same program, okay, and therefore doing the same thing. And if there are three, then you'd have three hypostases. That would be then the term the Greek fathers would use, one ousia, one determinate intelligible content that expresses or is what they are, namely God. But it's present in three hypostases. But when it was present in one, which is sort of what, when you in the creed, when it refers to the begetting of the Son, it's sort of operating within that assumed context that the Father is there first, not temporally, of course, because this is happens before the ages, but causally, the Father is there and then begets the Son. So you're sort of envisioning the point at which there was just the Father. And within that context, you could say that the divine essence is the Father. But then, of course, that divine essence comes to be present in the Son as well, and then in the Holy Spirit. So you have three persons all sharing the one essence. So that's a bit of digression on that particular phrase in discussion in St. Athanasius. But I think it's important because otherwise it can be confusing, and you can end up accusing the fathers of equivocating and so on, which I don't think they're doing. I think they're dealing with this very flexible concept that I think we're in a good position to understand intuitively because we're familiar with how this works with programs, that you can have a program that's present in one computer or in many, and it's this exact same program.
Yeah. What made me understand how this is very complex, right? The fathers, and like how it's important to understand what they're saying correctly, is reading Saint Cyril of Alexandria, because as you know, a lot of monophysites use him as their guy because he says a lot of things, because they say a lot of things that Saint Cyril himself says, and Saint Cyril of Alexandria says a lot of things that, if taken and read in a different context, is going to seem very difficult to argue that he is a Diophysite, right? Like, in a sense, it seems like outside of one work, which is a biblical commentary before the Nestorian controversy, there's not like an explicit statement of, for example, two natures. So if you try to do like magical, like, oh, does he say the magical word, right? Like this kind of like research, then you're going to be very disappointed with some of the things, right? What one needs to do, it's the same thing with the Bible, right? A lot of debates are happening about the Bible, but a lot of people treat certain passages by themselves without kind of like explaining the metaphysics or the presuppositions around it. And I think that's the biggest mistake a lot of people make in these discussions, is that if you want to understand, let the fathers speak for themselves, then you need to kind of listen to the presuppositions that they had in the first place. And I think that's going to make a lot of things easier in general. And as I said, like the same, like it's when you're reading this kind of stuff for the first time, like you're reading Saint Cyril of Alexandria, and he says one nature of God, the Word incarnate, for the first time, you're going to be caught for a loop, right? That's going to take you out of, that's going to surprise you. It's like, what? That's crazy. How does that make any sense? That's interesting. You can either fall into the sensationalism, or you can just say, well, this is not easy, right? I mean, it's never supposed to be easy. If this was supposed to be easy, it will kind of go against the idea of, the knowledge of God being like this hidden treasure that we must seek and find. It's not something that's supposed to be easily accessible to everyone in the world. But the final question I had prepared, and after that we can move to the live chat questions.
Let me
I
just add
think,
a quick comment on what you just
yeah,
said,
yeah,
okay? That should not be at all surprising, because if you think of the word nature or natural as they work in English, they too have an incredible range of uses. And if you know the book called Studies in Words by C.S. Lewis, it's like 8 or 10 chapters. Each of them is on a different word and all the different meanings it can have. And the first chapter is on nature, and it's like 80 pages long. And he goes through why and how you get this vast range of meanings sort of emerging out of a single root idea. And that's true, just as true in Greek as it is in English, that words have, they're almost like living things. If you think of a flower or a tree, how from one root it grows into a great expanse that has many different parts, and they look very different from each other. And so you just have to be aware of words in their context and in relation to their history. And Lewis is very good on all of that. That's a book I would recommend to anyone. It's just interesting in its own right, the words that he deals with. And this becomes very problematic for people who think in very fixated terms, and I'll just throw out there. So you often hear people that get puzzled when St. Paul says that that same-sex intercourse in Romans 1, he says it's against nature, contrary to nature. Whereas people will say, well, animals do it. Okay, so what could be more natural than that? But what's natural means different things in different contexts. And he's referring to our nature as what we're intended to be, which is the common meaning that it has, I think, in both Scripture and the Fathers. And that's very different from what in fact exists, okay? Because nature is fallen, as he goes on to describe in Romans 8, the whole nature, all of nature is groaning in travail. So, we have to be aware that nature and what's natural is highly ambiguous and depends a lot. You have to read beyond, you might say, to the word, read beyond the words to the meaning. And of course, when you do, you see that what St. Cyril is actually meaning by that phrase is pretty much right on board with what the other fathers were saying as well. So
yeah. I suppose you kind of answered this as well, but we can go over this again. Is what's the orthodox way of demonstrating the simplicity of God? That's basically the question. So, you can explain this briefly to people that are new here to the stream, perhaps.
So kind of goes back to something we were talking about earlier. Why would you even say that God is simple? Well, first of all, God is immaterial. So he's not a composite of form and matter. And then furthermore, he's not dependent upon anything for his existence. So even he's simple in a more radical, more fundamental way than, say, the angels are. The angels are also immaterial, but yet they're dependent upon a creator to bring them into being. And so you can distinguish with the angels between what it is to be an angel, their essence, versus the fact that it actually exists. In Latin, that would be its esse. And so for God, there's no such distinction either. And so those are some of the reasons why, it's important to say that God is simple. And there are arguments for why God is simple. God, as the creator of all things, is the source of matter. Therefore, he's not composed of matter. And he's the source of being itself. So therefore, you can't distinguish in him between his essence and his existence. So I hope that's adequate for what they're asking about. Okay.
Yeah. All right. So we can get to the live chat questions. We had two super chats so far. I would like to thank Chronosion and Basil Gildersleeve. Kronos' question was, I know the Orthodox don't believe in absolute divine simplicity, but they do believe in some version of divine simplicity. Could you please explain the difference?
Yeah. Well, of course, the phrase absolute divine simplicity, that's sort of a modern terminology. As far as I know, none of the fathers or even scholastics put it quite that way. But it can be helpful as a way of sort of distinguishing the Western view of divine simplicity from the Greek patristic view. Okay. And if you want to call the Western more absolute, that's fine, as long as you go on to explain what you mean by that. I think the crucial difference, as I mentioned earlier, they agree about a lot of things: the immateriality, the what's called aseity, the fact that God is not dependent upon anything else for his existence; he's not created, and also the thing again I mentioned earlier, that God doesn't participate in anything other than himself, and it's not by participation that he has the attributes that he does. That's all common ground for both East and West. To me, that's pretty absolute. Okay, that's I would think you in any normal meaning of the word, that is absolute divine simplicity. But if you want to add the further thing that Augustine said, that the divine essence is the same as each different divine attribute, wisdom, power, goodness, also activity and will and knowledge, okay, which are, and this is where I think it gets very problematic, as I mentioned earlier, because those are contingent in some respects, whereas the divine essence is not. Okay, but if you want to go down that road and add that further statement that Augustine adds and call that absolute divine simplicity, then the East does not believe in absolute divine simplicity. And that's fine, because you shouldn't, because it's a bad idea. And it leads to theological determinism, as I pointed out earlier. So that's the only sense in which you could say that the East does not believe in absolute divine simplicity. And I think it's a good thing.
All right. So just to make sure so that people might not misunderstand you, because you made the point about, well, in a sense, we believe that God is absolutely simple, which I've heard some fathers say that. They don't say absolute divine simplicity as the way that we use it today. As you said, it's a modern term. So I've seen even a lot of people question, wait, but we have church fathers that say God is absolutely simple. Yeah, absolute divine simplicity as a name is we're not saying God is, we don't believe in non-absolute divine simplicity. That will be ridiculous, right? It's just a name that applies in a different way to that specific context. But yeah, as you can see, my commentary is basically that the main difference is that though we agree that God is not composed of parts, he's not made of parts, he is simple, and he does not participate in things to be what he is. He still has distinctions in terms of his attributes, both from himself and between themselves. Basil asks £5 super chat. He asks, is the virtual distinction a good account of the distinctions among God's attributes when the virtual distinction assumes richness in the object, but God is absolutely simple? So I suppose he's asking from the more Thomistic account of virtual distinction. What would you say to that? I think that's a really good question, by the way.
Well, yeah. So I'm not sure I totally understand the question, so virtual distinction, as I understand it, we're referring to virtus in Latin, power or capacity. So the ability to do something, and so a virtual distinction is the kind that is present in God insofar as he's capable of doing many things. So there's even for a Thomist, there's a virtual distinction between God's ability to create, and his ability to know, or to give life. Okay, so to some things he gives life, to others he doesn't, yet he knows all of them. So knowledge and giving of life are virtually distinct in God, but that distinction only arises because of the sort of a logically prior distinction among creatures. And the Thomist would want to say, but no, these are not actually different powers that can be distinguished in God himself. I assume that's the sort of thing this person has in mind.
Yeah, he gave a definition from Wilner's Dictionary of Scholastic Philosophy. The definition of virtual distinction in this case is a logical or mental distinction between different aspects of only one essence or perfection, where the being is actually one and indivisible, but is rich enough to present various aspects of its reality to the mind. Sounds very similar to epinoia, but I will, from my vantage point, I will kind of ask, are these various aspects of of its reality, are they real? Or are they not?
Yeah.
Are they only real in the mind and not real in the external world? I think that's the crucial question, really.
Yeah. Yeah. And that definition, I think, fudges on that a little bit, or at least doesn't commit itself to in virtue of what is the thing able to manifest itself in such a diversity of ways. Aquinas does say, when he talks about the divine attributes in the commentary on the sentences, he does say that the different names we give to God, like being and power and wisdom and goodness, have what's the term he uses? A foundation, I think, in the divine being, a foundation in reality. So it's not, sometimes people think that for Aquinas, these are just conceptual distinctions that we draw as creatures because we're incapable of understanding the true unity and being of God. But he does say, that the distinctions we draw have a foundation in God himself, a foundation in reality in God himself. But he doesn't sort of try to elaborate or explain that. So it ends up being a little unclear, and that's why Duns Scotus comes along a little later and says, so they're actually, he introduces this other kind of distinction called a formal distinction, that they're formally distinct from one another and from the divine essence. I think that's kind of taking advantage of this open question that Aquinas had left hanging out there that he hadn't really addressed. So I don't know, with all that said, getting back to the question, I want to say, if I understood the question correctly, I'm kind of inclined to say something like yes and no, because it is true that these different divine energies that we, in the Greek tradition, would distinguish, and say they are distinct from one another, power and being and goodness and life. They only become manifest as distinct when God creates. If insofar as you can envision the state of God prior to creation, which we really can't do, but let's try anyway, then it's not clear what it would mean to say that God's goodness and life and wisdom are distinct from each other in that sort of pre-creational state, except insofar as God knows them to be distinct, because he knows already that he can manifest them in different ways, right? If that's what you mean by distinct, then they're distinct, fine. But if what you mean is already manifested as distinct, then they're not until he creates. I think the place that you see maybe a somewhat clearer state of distinction among the energies, even prior to creation, is when you get to the divine logoi, or logi, in the Greek pronunciation. So the thing about these is that the way they're understood by the fathers, by Dionysius and Maximus and Polemos, is that each logos is a distinct act of will by which God calls a particular being into reality. And these exist prior to creation because they're that by which God creates. And they're sort of the divine intentions and acts of will by which he creates each individual thing. And they're distinct from one another as distinct acts of will. And they exist prior to creation. Now, they don't exist independently of creation. If God had chosen not to create then the divine logi of beings also would never have been. But since he does choose to create, they exist, and there's sort of the particular determination of the divine will that accompanies the act of creation. And it can be broken down into a plurality of acts of will. And that's how the fathers, I think about the logi. And then for Gregory Palamas, the logi are a form of the divine energy. So you do have that, and I think that's a case or sort of a context where there's a clear distinction among energies, even causally prior to the act of creation, although not totally apart from the act of creation. Now that's a complicated answer, but it's just because it's a complicated question. What kind of distinctions can there be in God prior to creation? That's not something that you should be quick to just give a simple one for all answer to. It takes a little clarification as to what do we mean by distinct, and what do we mean by prior to creation. And I think as you work through that, you'll see that there is a form of distinction, but in some ways it's not really fully complete until God does create.
Yeah, the way I've understood from the way some Thomists have explained virtual distinction to me is that it's explained as something that's merely mental, right? It's explained as something that only exists in our mind. It's not something that when we make these distinctions or claims about certain statements about God and his attributes, these claims they're not mapped down to the external world or anything like that. Whereas when we say, for example, there's a distinction between the essence and energy of God, we're not just saying only in our minds, right?
Let's see that.
Yeah.
If they say that, they're really not being good Thomists, because Aquinas says that these distinctions have a foundation in reality.
Yeah.
It says they're merely mental.
Yeah.
He has a different kind of category of distinction. The classic example, I think he gets all this from Boethius, where Boethius talks about there are two different words for sword in Latin. I forget what they are, but you might say sword and blade. Okay. And they're just different words for the same thing. That's just a purely verbal distinction or mental distinction, but there's no foundation for it in reality. And for Aquinas, the distinction among the divine attributes is not like that. There is a foundation in reality. And like I was saying, I think one way to cash that out is by recalling this obvious point that God is aware of his own power and life and wisdom and goodness as different because they're capable of being manifested differently from one another, as they are when he creates, okay? Because he gives being to all things, he gives life to only some of them, and he gives knowledge or wisdom to only a subset of those. So they're differently manifested, and he's aware that they can be differently manifested from all eternity. And so in that sense, the distinction among them has a foundation in reality in the capacity God has to create such a vast diversity of creatures. And that's not just a mental distinction, okay? So I think the Thomists, maybe some of them are just kind of careless when they throw these terms around. And so I would encourage them to go back and read Aquinas, read that passage, that long discussion of the divine attributes in the commentary and the sentences where he goes into this.
Yeah. And let me see. I think is there any more question? All right. So there's a couple of questions that some users that I recorded from that I thought was interesting. Someone asked, can you ask Mr. Bradshaw whether the Western theologians have mistakenly made the divine essence into a passive God, which eventually led to the atheism of the West today? So is there kind of like a societal consequence of this theological belief? What would you say to this?
I wouldn't say passive, but in other respects, I think it does contribute ultimately to what kind of unfolds in Western history, the growing secularism and ultimately atheism. So Gregory Palamas points this out in his book, 150 Chapters. At one point, he says that an essence to imagine an essence without an energy is to imagine something that doesn't exist. Because what that would mean in his context in Greek, if you talk about an Ousia that has no Energia, you're talking about something that is just a mental fiction, because if it exists, of course, it's going to be manifest in some way. And really, this goes back before Palamas to the Sixth Ecumenical Council and the resolution of the monoenergist controversy, when they said that, yes, if Christ has two natures, then there must be an energy corresponding to each of those natures, because otherwise to affirm the nature is an empty assertion, unless you recognize that that nature is manifest in some way. So this idea that a nature or an essence, and those are more or less equivalent terms in this context, has to be manifest in some energy, some energia, is very deeply rooted, and it's actually taught by the Sixth Ecumenical Council. So that's why Palamas says what he says. And in my book, I quote that in the epilogue to the book. And I sort of point out that, yeah, if you look at Western history, the unfolding of Western philosophy subsequent to scholasticism, in light of this sort of an axiom that an ousia without any energia is just a fiction of the mind, then you can see how it kind of makes sense that atheism becomes so prevalent in the West. Now, I don't think it's sort of like an immediate step. I think there's a long process of unfolding that takes place. And I think the theological determinism and the predestinarianism that's sort of present in Western theology all the way from Augustine on plays a big role in that it becomes more and more a kind of an albatross around the neck of Western theology, and leads to these really vicious and intense debates over things like predestination during the Reformation era. But even prior to that, if you look at late medieval scholasticism, the thing that caused the whole edifice to collapse was voluntarism in the 14th century. And I mean, this is a complicated story. Maybe it's too much to get into right now, but I think a lot of those problems that were endemic to Western scholasticism that you see unfolding and leading ultimately to collapse and then to the rise of modern thought, modern philosophy, only arise because they don't have this distinction, and therefore they're working with a version of divine simplicity itself that I think is too simple. It's too unqualified in the sense that they get it all from Augustine. And so I do think that has consequences. Absolutely.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Pretty much everything you said. It's a point that I myself make. I mean, eventually the logical conclusion of this kind of theology is that you can't really have an actual access to God outside of conjecture. And conjecture is usually not a good basis that you want to have when it comes to interacting with God. Another question that was asked: could you say God's power and control is the same as God's potential / dunamis and act / actuality / energia?
God's power and control. No, I mean, those are broad terms, and so yeah, dunamis can be translated as power. So yeah, you got that. And so his power and control, you might say, is one of the divine dunames, a power that God has. I think that's fine. I wouldn't want to go beyond that and sort of make a sweeping identification in general, because again, these are words you have to always take in context. But sure, as far as it goes, that's fine.
Yeah, so I guess the question is kind of this. Well, someone has another question that is very similar to this, which is so someone just asked me to ask you about passive and active potency and how it relates to, I suppose, how it relates to orthodoxy, right? So, like, what do they mean? Is it something? Are obviously, are these things applicable to God? Why not? That kind of a question, I suppose.
Yeah, well, that's a good question, because Just the distinction of active and passive potency is kind of common sense, and it's one that Aristotle draws, that you have the potency to act, but also the potency to be acted upon in many different ways. I mean, you're acted upon if you put your hand out in the sun and your skin gets darker. Okay, you're being acted upon by the sun, and that's a potency that it's present in your skin. But of course, or in your hand, but of course, your hand has also many potencies to do things. So, can you draw a similar distinction in God? No, actually, Palamas does talk about this, and he says that God only acts and is not acted upon. He's not passive. And so that would be a way that actually Palamas and the Thomists, I think, would agree. That's something, of course, the Thomists make a big point of as well. No passive potency in God. The thing you've got to be careful about, though, or that's a little tricky here, is that the distinction between to act upon and to be acted upon may itself be too simple or too much of a bare dichotomy, because there's also interaction. Okay, the kind that is taking place right now between you and me and anybody else who's watching. Okay, I'm saying certain words, that person is receiving those words, hearing them, understanding them, but that's not just a case of my acting and that person being acted upon, because people receive these words differently, right? It depends an awful lot on your own state of understanding, also on your state of will. Are you receptive? Are you interested? Are you sort of willing to listen and be convinced? Or maybe you're hearing what I'm saying as the words of an enemy and you just want to find ways to prove I'm wrong. Okay, that's what I'm referring to as interaction, that this is what we do all the time, every day with one another. We're interacting and not just being acted upon. We're receiving what's given to us or what's presented to us and then engaging with it. And those can't really be separated. There's not a separate stage of reception followed by engagement. It all takes place together all at once. So I do think God interacts with creatures. That doesn't mean that he's acted upon by creatures, but it does mean that what he wills is, to some extent, a response to what we will and what we freely choose. And this is, again, why I would reject theological determinism. I don't think the whole history of the world is just a script that God wrote prior to creation, and things are just unfolding according to that script. I think that God is actively choosing to respond to prayer and to engage with us in all the ways that he does, and throughout all facets of our life. And so that's, again, not being acted upon, but it is interaction with our free will. So that I hope is helpful, that the bare dichotomy of acting and being acted upon is itself, I think, a little too simple.
Okay. Someone called, well, his name is Lord Have Mercy, gave a $5 super chat. Thank you. He asks, how is it possible to participate in the energies but not the essence when they are metaphysically inseparable and make up one and the same being? What would your response to this be?
Yeah. Well, the idea of participating in the divine energy is really comes from St. Paul. Like you mentioned, David, that article I have called The Divine Energies in the New Testament, it goes into this in a lot of detail. St. Paul refers to, in Colossians 1:29, there's a wonderful passage where he refers to, he's talking about his whole ministry, and he refers to the Energia of God that is being energumenein, and that's from the verb that is cognate with the noun energia. Okay, so energumenein would mean being realized and made effective within me, Paul, within his ministry. So it's the divine energy that's being realized and made effective within the course of Paul's ministry. So Paul is participating in that energy of God, again, not as, a passive thing, that Paul is just like sort of a puppet and God is pulling the strings. It's rather that Paul, through his own free will and his own human activity, is cooperating with God and being responsive to God's will and his direction, so that what Paul does is also what God is doing. Paul's ministry is a form of divine activity in the world. And that's what we mean when we refer to participating in the divine energy. It's what the fathers refer to as synergy, where human activity and divine activity coalesce and become the same thing. Okay. Now, nothing about that at all implies that Paul then thereby is participating in the divine ousia. That would be something totally different. That would mean becoming the same sort of thing that God is by having the same essence. All right. The way you and I are the same sort of thing, we're both human beings because we both have the human essence. Paul never refers to or suggests anything like that. So synergy exists. It's a form of participation that's just totally different from participating in the essence of something. So that's why this all makes sense, and it's biblical. Okay, it's a kind of a way of speaking and thinking that goes back to St. Paul, and the fathers adopt it, and it's just very intuitive in the Greek language. So
Yeah, I think two great explanations I have in mind, which I've used, is the ice pack explanation, as well as like higher lower divinity kind of directionality, where what you're getting from God as divine energy is a reflection of himself, right? So that's what you're participating in, and that's what the distinction points out, is this I guess actually that's good enough statement. Yeah. So it reminds me of Saint Peter saying in 2 Peter 1:4, partaking of the divine nature, right? And many of the fathers interpret that as him saying partaking of the divine nature through grace. Grace is an energy, right? Or partaking of the, for example, attributes of God, which are also named energies, right? The life of God. And so that's the point and purpose of that kind of language, is that we must also understand that inseparability does not, like a good example will be Christology, right? The two natures in Christ, humanity and divinity, are inseparable, but we still use a language, for example, that Christ in his humanity died and suffered on the cross, right? That's an acceptable language to use. Even though they are inseparably united, it is still very clear, very obviously seen that, yeah, in Christ, indeed, that the reason why he dies as a person is because he has humanity, which in his humanity he goes through this experience. For example, it's not the same. It's a very similar logic, but it's not one-to-one the same, because we're dealing with multiple natures in this case. But I think even with human beings, right, in a sense, the body and soul, the soul interpenetrates the body in some sense, but we still understand that even though we don't say, my body just drank water, we don't say something like that. I drank water is what we say. We also understand simultaneously, hey, this function of drinking, physically drinking, that is something that we do because we have a body and it's proper to our body. I think the logic is also very similar here. So the next question I have, and I'm gonna have to go through this quickly, because in a couple of minutes I have another stream to jump to. So I wish we could do this for longer, but we can. I definitely would like to have you on for another time if you have the time as well. Hopefully you enjoyed being on my channel and presenting, just having this dialogue as well. Another question is, in the epilogue of your book, it says that the Thomistic/Augustinian view of simplicity led to a sphere of natural reason independent of revelation in the post-schism West. Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the epilogue, I think, does try to elaborate, but also I cite there some authors like Marie Dominique Chenu, I think, is one, and R.W. Southern is another, who talk about how naturalism, you can see it developing, beginning in the 12th century in the West. I mean, prior to full-blown scholasticism, maybe as scholasticism itself is beginning to develop with people like Abelard. And how is that related to the Augustinian Thomistic understanding of divine simplicity? So the basic idea, and again, I mean, you read the book for more detail, but the basic idea is that if you have the essence energies distinction, then you have a way of thinking about and understanding how God is present in creation, and it truly is God. It's the divine energies which truly are God, okay? God as he is active and manifest, that constitute the being and the goodness and the life and the wisdom and the power and so forth of creatures. And so God is, you might say, immediately present in creation. And therefore, one thing I talk about in the book is that the theophanies of Scripture, like the pillar of flame in the wilderness and the burning bush and the tongues of flame at Pentecost, those were understood by the fathers as the visible appearance of God, okay? They're not just creatures, whereas Augustine says they're creatures. And the reason he has to say that is because he's got this radical or very sharp distinction between the divine essence, and anything that truly is God is the divine essence. And then the other possibility is that something is a creature. And those are the only two possibilities there are. If it's God, it's the divine essence. Otherwise, it's a creature. And the theophanies are not the divine essence, so they must be creatures. And what you get, that's sort of encapsulating in this particular case of the theophanies, but it's also sort of expressing a broader view that God is not immediately present in creation. Creatures there's a sharp chasm, in a sense, between God and creation. And you don't have that category of the divine energies to give a name to and express God as he is present within creation. Okay. So there's, I think, a sense in which the immanence of God to creation kind of, you lose sight of it. It's not that they want to deny it, right? It's just that they don't have the right terminology to express it fully. And that does have consequences. And it does lead, and again, I would refer you to these authors that I cite in the epilogue for a lot of detail about this, but it does lead to a way of thinking in the 12th century and later, in which they come to more and more sort of focus on nature as a self-subsistent reality. Not that they ever would deny that God upholds nature in existence. Okay, that's definitely an affirmed tenet of Roman Catholic scholastic teaching. But nonetheless, you get the idea, that nature can be understood in its own right and studied at that level, so to speak. And that's what these historians, people like Southern and Chanou and others, refer to as the rising naturalism of the late Middle Ages. So I'm just pointing out of the epilogue some of the ways that this becomes a natural attitude to take, given the Augustinian dichotomy between God and creature. Okay. And the way that's articulated, understood, as opposed to the way the Greek fathers had understood that. Yeah, there's a difference, obviously, but there's a presence and a kind of interpenetration as well, in which the energies are God as he is present in creation. Okay.
Yep. There's some people, so I want to kind of make a small announcement as well. I have to go in half an hour, so I gotta cut this. Not gonna cut the stream right here, but I'm not gonna take any more live chat questions. If you have super chat questions, I'm free to take that, but for the sake of time, I'm not gonna take any additional questions. So I think there's only there are two questions that I have saved here. One is really simple. Does Dr. Bradshaw affirm a real distinction between the hypostasis and essence of God? I mean, I think the answer is probably yes, but Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, so, but I'd be wary of the term real distinction because people often use that phrase without thinking very carefully about what it means and without being able to define it. It's a term that the Greek fathers don't generally use. It comes from Aquinas, but when he uses it, if you look this up, I have an article where I do talk about this in some detail. And for him, it's kind of a state of art, okay? And it refers to the kind of distinction there is between two things that are opposed by some relation of opposition or of origin. And he has in mind a case like the Father and the Son, who clearly are distinct as Father and Son by that relation between, which is a relation of origin and also of opposition, okay? And there's a similar distinction between either one of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So in Latin theology, there's a real distinction between the three persons, or among the three persons, between any two of the three persons. But there's not a real distinction between any one of the persons and the divine essence. Now, into Greek ears, sort of Greek patristic ears, that sounds strange, because clearly the hypostases, each hypostasis is different from the ousia, okay? Because the ousia is shared by the three hypostases. And it's what they have in common, whereas they're different as hypostases. But you just have to understand what the Latins are referring to when they use this term real distinction, okay? So if you mean, is there a relation of opposition between a person and the essence? Well, no, there's not, actually. Not in the same way there is between the Father and the Son. So no, there's not a real distinction in that particular technical sense between the person and the essence. The thing that's tricky, though, and very confusing, and I talk about this in that article, it's called Essence and Energies, What Kind of Distinction? And you can actually find it online. It's posted on my website on academia.edu. The thing that's confusing is that after Aquinas, the later Thomists come to use that term real distinction in a quite different way to mean a distinction that would that holds or would be present independently of its being cognized by a created intellect. So a distinction is only real if it's sort of present in the nature of things independently of the created mind. Okay. And the reason they come to use the term in this way, as far as I could ever make out, is because, there was this distinction, this controversy rather, that arose shortly after the death of Aquinas. What kind of distinction is there between essence and existence in general? And this is an issue that Giles of Rome brought up, and he had a certain teaching about that was contrary to the teaching of Aquinas, and it led to a big controversy. And so, part of that, it came to be phrased as, is there a real distinction between essence and existence? And that's that when you are using the phrase real distinction in that sort of a way, you're going to be using it not the way that Aquinas himself used it, but rather in this other way. Is there a distinction that exists independently of an act of cognition by some created mind? And that's the meaning that the term usually has in scholastic manuals. Okay, and I cite some of those in my paper. You can look all that up in that paper. Is there a distinction of that kind between any person of the Trinity and the divine essence? Well, yes, there is, because they would be distinct and even independently of creatures, the existence of creatures. Of course they would, because the distinction, three persons, one essence, would hold even if God had never created. And it's totally unaffected by the act of creation and by our being aware of the distinction. So it all depends on what you mean by real distinction, okay? And I'd urge everyone who uses that phrase, don't use it without defining what you mean, okay? Because people use it without defining it, and it leads to all kinds of needless controversy and confusion that doesn't have to be there. But it's a very confusing term, and you really have to define it.
Yeah, and like there's also like the difference between like real distinction major and real distinction minor that also like is really important. But yeah, the point about like the yeah, like Thomas does say that there's a real distinction between the persons in the Trinity, but they're all identical to the essence, which I think that's not only to the Greek patristic, I think that's just kind of like a question mark for most people. It's something that seems very difficult. The logic is there. Like I can kind of understand. It's the same like it's the same thing that Saint Augustine is trying to safeguard. I understand because saying they're not in their kind of metaphysic would be to say that they kind of participate in the essence in an external way, which, believe it or not, was actually a dispute in the Monophysite East between, I think, Damian and Peter, right? Damian of Antioch and Peter of Alexandria. Might have been different places, but they actually had this discussion, and one of them argued that the persons of the Trinity are divine by participating in the divine essence, like kind of like this theology. I
Right,
think
the tritheism.
yeah.
Right.
So it's something that has precedence, and I can understand kind of like why they will want to move to that direction. But it's certainly not something anyone who has read the Cappadocian Fathers, especially, it's not something that someone who has read them will kind of see that and say that makes sense. I don't think that really makes a lot of sense, at the very least. But I think
No, I'll just throw in another plug for my analogy with the program, because you wouldn't say that the computer participates in the program. The computer exemplifies or instantiates the program, maybe that it and the program is present in it and makes it what it is. That's all fine, but to talk about participation is to presuppose that the thing being participated in already exists independently of the participant. Okay, that's the Platonic meaning of the term. He's thinking of the relationship between forms and sensible objects, and that's not the relationship you have between the divine essence and the persons of the Trinity. The divine essence never exists independently of the persons of the Trinity. So that's why the fathers would never say that the persons participate in the divine essence.
this kind of reminds me, because in half an hour I'm going to be on Jay Dyer's channel to talk about the Filioque, and I think that's going to be a very important stream because there's a lot of things that we've prepared that might be surprisingly pleasant for a lot of the viewers. And it reminds me like this identification of essence with existence, right? There's kind of this tendency in the West. It's really interesting because it becomes relevant in the debates about the Filioque as well. Because Gregor of Cyprus, for example, seemingly paradoxically argued for something very interesting. He argued that the Holy Spirit has existence from the Father alone. But then he says, well, that's different from existence, which is from the Father through the Son. It's kind of like, that sounds really strange. That sounds very contradictory until you realize, wait a second, if you apply this to human beings, for example, you have existence from your Father, but are you existing from your Father? Well, no, right? So it shows us that even on the created level, there's actually a distinction between the two, having existence and existing, right? So we will say, I suppose we can say we are self-subsisting, we are a unique mode of existence, right? Like hypostasis. It's the same kind of idea with the distinction between nature, essence, and person, or hypostasis, right? Same kind of having existence is the question of person, but existence is the question of kind of like the nature operating in a sense, not completely, but in a sense. So I think that's something that I think is another thing that's missed in these discussions. But one final question, as I can't get to the more questions because I'm running out of time here. One final question that was asked, actually a long time ago in the stream. This person asks, can you say that energy is physis, that is nature, or is part of physis, like Saint Cyril says that hypostasis is physis? Also, against Eunomius, Gregory of Nyssa says that there's nothing uncreated but his nature. What is the response to this? I kind of gave the response to this in the chat, but I'd like
Yeah.
to get this question to you as well.
Yeah, it's a good question because the word fusus, like I was saying a while ago, is a term that can mean different things. And you really have to look at it in context. So I think sometimes you would say that the energy is sort of part of, or at least it's the active I don't like the word part, but it's the active manifestation of the nature. For instance, in that verse from Second Peter that you mentioned, 2 Peter 1:4, that we are partakers of the divine nature. The fathers understand that as not that we're participating in the divine Ousia, which would make us the same sort of being God is, but that we're sharing in God's activity, his energy through synergy, and therefore share, like St. Paul was. Like I mentioned, St. Paul is a great example of this, that kind of synergy in which his whole ministry is a way that God is being actively present in the world. So that's, you might say, fusus in the broad sense. There's also, though, often the fathers will use fusus just as a synonym for ousia. Like, I think if you look at the Dialectica of St. John of Damascus, when he defines it, I think, if I recall correctly, that's pretty much what he does, is just to equate these two terms. And that was more common in the context of Christology and the Christological debates. And that's fine, and actually even in Trinitarian doctrine, they're pretty much equivalent. But they're not always equivalent, and you just have to be aware of that, and take them in a particular context.
Yeah, I guess the other question, because this is from the same person, was Saint Gregory of Nyssa says there's nothing uncreated but except for the divine nature. I kind of gave the explanation because of Saint Gregory of Nyssa talking about distinct things in God as uncreated as well. But what would your general answer to be to this kind of like a argument? Because I've heard some people make this argument before.
Yeah, well, so that would be sort of what I was calling fusus in the broad sense, that incorporates the divine energies. The only qualification I think you might want to give to that is, like I was talking about a while ago, that the divine logi are uncreated. Gregory says there's nothing uncreated except the divine nature, right? So you might take that to mean the divine nature sort of as it exists in itself independently of creation. But the tricky thing is that then the acts of will that God performs in choosing to create and to create each particular thing are themselves uncreated, but they wouldn't exist apart from the decision to create. So they're linked in their being to creation. Okay, the act of will to create each one of us wouldn't exist if we didn't also exist. Okay, not that it gets its being from us; it's just the opposite. We get our being from that act of will. But still, so the divine nature, I think the way he's referring to it there, you shouldn't think of it as sort of God just totally in himself apart from the act of creation, because he's including the particular determinations of the divine will that arise because God chooses to create. All right.
Okay, and I think that should be, I think that should be enough. The stream has gone. It's been quite a long stream. I'm really happy to have you on here. I really enjoyed this. I really enjoyed listening to your thoughts, and a lot of it certainly is. A lot of it certainly is congruent with what the fathers say as well, at least from the reading I have done for the last 3 years. And I think a lot of people in my audience really enjoyed listening to you as well. And I'd love to have you back on as well. Is there anything you want to say before we end the stream here?
No, just I appreciate it, and I think this has been a great discussion, and I appreciate all the questions. There's some really great questions people have raised. So
yes. Again, Dr. Bradshaw, thank you for coming here. And thank you all for watching the stream. I will see all of you in the next stream. And goodbye. Thank you for watching. And I'll see you in the next stream or perhaps the next video. Thanks for watching.
Okay.
All right.